In 2020, Democrats took full control of Washington.
And it will give Democrats control of the Senate.
Joe Biden has been elected.
But Republicans stood up in the states.
There was no blue wave. Democratic down-ballot disasters carried all the way to the state legislatures.
Now, we're the last line of defense against the Democrats' socialist agenda. The ways we're fighting back are bigger than you think. All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to It's Bigger Than You Think, a conversation about the politics that most impact our daily lives. I'm Annie Moore, I'm your host, and our guest today I'm super excited about. It's Washington Secretary of State Kim Wyman. She's going to be talking about election reform, RSLC's Commission on Election Integrity, and kind of everything in between. Super pumped you're here, Secretary. Thank you so much for joining us. To kick off the conversation, could you provide a little bit of background information about RSLC's Commission on Election Integrity, why it was formed and, what we're hoping to accomplish with it?
Oh, well, I think it really came out of the aftermath of 2020, and that was a remarkable election for all secretaries of state across the country. A lot of unusual circumstances with COVID and trying to figure out how to conduct it. And then, obviously an emotional election after election day, and, a lot of lawsuits, a lot of misinformation and disinformation coming from, quite frankly, both sides of the aisle at times. And so I think a number of us started having conversations with the Republican secretaries of state, and we were trying to figure out how we could start, kind of really doing a deep dive in what things worked in states and in our respective states. What were the policies that were really effective in delivering voter services and providing that access and security that we really need in elections. And out of those conversations kind of came this idea of let's get together and let's formalize that and let's put it in a document so we can have a starting place for conversation. And I think that was really our intention from the beginning.
That's awesome. There's a lot of states that are represented on the commission. Can you talk a little bit about the makeup? 25 states, I think, are represented, with some of them being blue states like your own. Why is it important to have so many different state leaders on board with this project?
Well, again, I think coming out of 2020, we had a lot of disinformation and misinformation spread. And I think we need to get back to the conversation of what are things that serve voters well. How are states balancing access and security well? And we have real examples across the country. And elections, while many people make them very partisan, and I think people on the left and the right talk in terms of voter fraud and voter suppression, what I was really hoping to get out of this was a conversation and a dialogue of how can we improve our elections and access to elections for all Americans and put in the security measures that inspire confidence. And so we knew that you can't just have it be a single party perspective, even though this is coming from Republican secretaries of state, that really those best practices come from all the states, because states are the incubators of innovation and good ideas. And so that's why, we're not trying to make this a partisan thing. We're really trying to make it a best practices and how do we improve elections. Yeah,
definitely love that. I think it's super important to have input from both sides of the aisle when people from every walk of life are voting. So can you talk a little bit about the key principles for election reform and why they're so important?
Well, ultimately, election administrators' jobs, and that would include secretaries of state, of course, is to inspire public confidence that the election was accurate and fair. And the way you do that is keeping access and security in balance. And really, when either of those gets out of balance, that's when you hear the cries of voter fraud or voter suppression. So our job is to try to bring this sort of neutral perspective to inspire confidence across the board. And out of these conversations comes a quote that I think actually came from now Lieutenant Governor John Husted of, elections officials' job is to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. And that kind of became a catchphrase that I know a lot of us are using. But ultimately, that is our job, and it's about inspiring confidence.
Definitely appreciate everything that you guys are doing. So the commission, you guys have recently released best practices for election reform that make it easier to vote and harder to cheat, exactly like we were just talking about. Do you think people are going to be surprised that we have examples from blue states like Colorado, New York, your own state that are, listed in the document?
I'm sure it will surprise a number of people. I think that the problem with election administration, really since the 2000 election, is campaigns have figured out that it's a really good way to attack the other side and to really politicize the administrative processes of election. And so, again, I think the strongest solutions to inspiring confidence come from bipartisan work and really both sides listening to the concerns of the other side and addressing them. I think the easy thing on the campaign side of our world is, these attacks, like I said, voter suppression, voter fraud, and they're easy bombs to throw. The hard part is doing the work in a way that inspires confidence. So, I think it's important that we're showing some of those success stories in states like mine in Washington, where we've been really pioneers in vote by mail and same day registration, automatic voter registration, and being kind of on that front wave of some of those innovations. How do we do it? And what are the safeguards that we built in to make those secure? And that conversation is important, and we should be doing it more instead of going down those partisan trails.
Yeah, that makes sense. Totally. So as you've been working on state-centered election reform, kind of the elephant in the room is HR 1. It's been moving through Congress. It got passed by the House. The Senate's, talking about it. Since election reform is such a complicated issue, it's so nuanced, can you just kind of explain to listeners in the simplest way possible why HR 1 is a bad bill and why you believe reforms actually need to happen at the state level?
Oh, absolutely. I think first and foremost, as a almost 30-year election official, Congress really didn't reach out to the election community. They didn't talk to state and local election officials, the people who are actually printing ballots and putting them in voters' hands and tabulating them, what things needed to be changed or improved. They just wrote a bill. I'm told by members of Congress that it was a democratically crafted bill, so there wasn't really a lot of input or any input by Republican colleagues. And that's inherently, in my opinion, the problem with it foundationally. And I'm been in this industry long enough to know how the Help America Vote Act was crafted. And in the House and the Senate, it was bipartisan. Bipartisan sponsors, bipartisan input. And I wish we could get back to that level. I'm not sure we can, but I would like to think we could, because that's really going to be in the best interest of Americans across the country. Then that secondary tier is it's an 800-page bill. And not only is it a long bill, it's a very prescriptive bill. They've put elements into this bill like telephone voting systems. I've again been in elections for 28 years. I'm not aware of a single jurisdiction in the country that uses a telephone voter registration system, but that's prescribed in the bill as something we all have to implement. So, you start looking at that level of detail, and you're codifying it in federal law, something that is going to be very difficult to change. It's going to make it impossible for states to have any kind of innovation or creative thought to improve our voter processes and elections. And that's the inherent, I think, flaw in the bill itself. And then finally, some of the prescriptive things like all states' tabulation systems must meet these new standards, the Voluntary Voting Standards Guide, the VVSG 2.0. That's very much in the weeds. And these are standards that the testing labs haven't even figured out how to test to. And the law requires it to be implemented by next January 2022. That's going to be a problem for every jurisdiction in the country. And if they can't certify their systems, they'll be decertified. So potentially we could be running elections next year on decertified equipment. And again, that's not going to inspire voter confidence. So the bill has some pretty systemic problems, and we need to address them in a bipartisan way.
Okay, so still on the same topic of HR 1, what do you say to anyone who says that those who oppose HR 1 is racist?
I think it's just one more attempt to, one, divide Americans, two, to try to discount people that might have any kind of criticism by using a very inflammatory word that I find offensive, as someone who's spent 28 years ensuring that every eligible person in my state has had the opportunity to register and vote and participate. So there's a part of me that is offended, but at the same time, I also know that it's just one more political tactic. It's just easy to throw out identity politics and just categorize people and throw these cast aspersions to paint us as being, some sort of awful people. And I say that as us because during the last campaign, there were some ads that definitely went to the heart of that against me and my other colleagues that were running for Secretary of State. And it was very hard not to take that personally. But I'm also reminded of a very famous Margaret Thatcher quote where she said she always knew she was winning the argument when her opposition started making personal attacks. So, I think that they can't get us on substance. So it's going to be something that's inflammatory and personal and degrading. And so we're just going to rise above it. And we're going to keep having a conversation of what matters to most Americans.
Some in the media, they've been kind of intrigued that you joined the commission since you are from a blue state. Why do you think your perspective is uniquely important, and what type of input were you able to provide the commission on mail-in and absentee ballots?
Well, what I found in 2020 that I'd never stopped to really think about in the Secretary of State Association, the National Association of Secretaries of State, of all of the secretaries of state going into 2020, there were only 2 of us who'd actually conducted elections at the local level. And I'm the only one in the country that has actually conducted vote by mail elections and expanded absentee elections at the local and state level. So I think my perspective is just unique with that experience. And, we talked to every state in the country during 2020, trying to help them expand their absentee voting and build in the security measures to inspire confidence. And so I think that experience really is relevant to this project. And because my state's been doing vote by mail elections for over 20 years, for almost 10 years now, we're uniquely positioned to bring that perspective of the things that works, why they work, and the things that don't work as well and you want to try to avoid, the mistakes that we made in our state. And so we had decades to go from poll site voting with low absentee ballots to full vote by mail, whereas some states last year had to do that in a matter of months. And I just think that there were a lot of lessons learned, and we should be trying to figure out the best in those lessons. What are the best practices? And that, like I said, is the genesis for this document. And I think that Washington's experience and my experience were uniquely combined to really make it more representative. And
so do you think that the American people may have changed their opinions on the importance of state officials like Secretary of State over the past year?
I think the American people are now more aware of what we do, and it was front and center for a lot of Americans. Having been in elections for as long as I have, I remember the 2000 election, and that was the year that I know many people listening to this probably don't even remember that election, but that was the year that the public found out that there were punch cards and chads and election officials actually counted ballots, and no one had stopped to think about that.
So do you get the sense that people think that your work is more important in light of what happened with last year? And like you specifically, you kind of like laid out the roadmap for a lot of people to kind of be able to vote safely during COVID.
Oh, absolutely. And, we saw it play out in a number of states, particularly the swing states. They became ground zero for the arguments and the lawsuits and the focus of most Americans. And again, getting back to that public confidence, it's just so important that states have the ability to create and make good laws that serve their voters in their states. The secretaries of state are responsible to their voters, and they stand for election every 4 years, in some cases every 2 years, to answer to their electorate. And it's just, we've got to figure out a way that we remember that we're serving all of our voters and not just those voters in our respective parties. But I think Americans now know that the Secretary of State or the chief election officer in each state is very important and does have an impact on how the public perceives the election.
Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience?
I think that we need to just continue to as secretaries of state, we need to continue to educate the public about the work that we do and our local election officials do every single day. Elections don't just happen once every 4 years. They're happening, in some states, multiple times a year. And the more that we can kind of show that be transparent and show that process of how we safeguard America's vote, how we make it accessible, the more we're going to build that confidence back. And it's going to take time, and it's going to take that, like I said, bipartisan efforts. We're going to have to work together with our state legislatures and not just have one party at the table. I think we're seeing that in Congress, and we're seeing it in states across the country, in blue states and red states, where if you're in the majority, you don't need to talk to the other side, and we're just going to drive whatever election laws forward. And that's great until your party's not in charge, or when the public starts to lose confidence. And I think that we've got to take a step back and take a deep breath and pause and move forward in a collaborative manner. And I think we can do that.
Well, Secretary Wyman, thank you so much for joining us today. It's so insightful and very interesting to hear about all of this from somebody who works on this issue literally every single day. So I want to thank everybody else for listening, and always remember that state politics are bigger than you think.